Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jennifer Kessler. I'm the Executive Director of the International Contemporary Ensemble. It is my great pleasure to introduce you to the next facilitator of our Ensemble Evolution panel discussion. The name of this panel is Interrogating Equity and Justice in both Classical and Mainstream Music. We at the International Contemporary Ensemble have been interrogating our own practices and history with a focus on equity and considering the ways that we've benefited from participating in a system that has largely upheld white people. We're in our own process of making many changes internally to how decisions get made with regards to more equitable programming, policy, curation, resource distribution, and hiring. And we are in the business of commissioning, developing, and performing works by living artists. And because we are connected to many artists, producers, presenters, funders, and other ensembles, we believe it's critical to bring people together around equity and justice conversations throughout our field. So for our Ensemble Evolution program, we invited Dr. Darrell Cooper to put together a panel to talk about interrogating equity and justice. That was his title. And it is my great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Darrell Cooper, who is one of the nation's leading cultural strategists and is the founder and CEO of Cultural Innovation Group, which is a boutique consulting agency specializing in systems change. He is the creator and host of the web series Flow, which I highly recommend checking out if you haven't yet. He's an adjunct professor at New York University and the City College of New York, and former program officer at the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs. He's worked at Lincoln Center Education on multiple social impact projects. And Darrell graduated from the Impact Program for Arts Leaders at Stanford University, is a member of the Diversity Scholars Network at the National Center for Institutional Diversity at University of Michigan. And he earned a BFA from Southern Methodist University and both an MA and Doctorate of Education from New York University. It is my great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Darrell Cooper.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for that introduction. It was incredible. My name is Dr. Darrell Cooper. I go by he, him, his pronouns. I am zooming in today from the occupied land of the Lenape people, also known as Midtown Manhattan. It is an honor to be back here at Ensemble Evolution yet again. I had a great time last year, and it's such an honor to be brought back here again today. And it's even more of an honor to be here today with the panel that we have assembled for this conversation. Without further ado, bringing in this panel, I would like to introduce Miss Patricia Robinson. Miss Patricia is a trailblazing leader that is highly recognized for her contributions in the media industry, community, and social activism engagement. Her exceptional work ethic, apparent leadership, commitment, consistency, and consummate professionalism has earned her a dynamic career as Vice President of HR and Community Engagement for Hot 97, WBLS, and WLIB, spanning over 20 years in the broadcast media industry. Patricia is actively teaching 2 courses as a professor at Westchester Community College. She is also currently the Director of Community Outreach for Colin Kaepernick's Know Your Rights Camp. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Patricia Robinson.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And I'm excited to be here today. And yes, I've spent over 20 years in the radio industry and doing a lot of community advocacy, things that are just passionate to my experience. So I'm excited to be here and to share what I can today. And hopefully we'll have a dynamic conversation.
Dynamic indeed. Next, I would like to bring in Garrett McQueen. Garrett McQueen is a bassoonist who has performed with orchestras across the country, including Knoxville Symphony, the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra, and the Detroit Symphony Orchestra. Today, Garrett works as a producer of digital and broadcast media with content featured on the Public Radio Exchange, PRX, and local radio stations across the country. In 2017, current named McQueen a Black talent in public media that you may not know, but you should. And in 2021, the New York Times noted his weekly podcast, Triloquy, great podcast, by the way, as a standout that's required listening for industry leaders and listeners alike. He serves on the board of the American Composers Forum and as the Equity Committee Chair, and is on the leadership teams of the Black Opera Alliance, the Gateways Music Festival, and the International Society for Black Musicians. Please join me in welcoming the classical agitator himself, Garrett McQueen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cooper, for that. I'm calling in today from the land of the Sioux, specifically the Wapakudi of the Eastern Dakota. I honor not only their ancestral rights to the land, but their contemporary rights to the land. As we continue to practice land acknowledgements and to learn more about the government-funded extermination of Indigenous people, including children, as has been recently discovered in the so-called land of Canada, we have to accept what it would really mean to serve justice to these people. This is something that I encourage every white homeowner, every white landowner, and every white business owner to actually consider when we make these land acknowledgements. When it comes time for you to give your stolen land back, where will you go? Will you stand in the way of this justice, or will you be a proponent of it? As Dr. Cooper said, my name is Garrett, and while I do maintain myself as a musician, a bassoonist, the majority of my work and my activism is in the digital sphere. The Triloquy podcast was built to challenge and ultimately decolonize the phrase classical music. We've spent way too many generations using that phrase in conjunction with one of the world's classical musics. And my mission is to help people understand that there's a much broader context of so-called classical music that we have to embrace if we allege to fight for equity. My work extends beyond the podcast sphere into radio. As it was mentioned, I'm the producer of a few nationally syndicated programs at the intersection of race and music, including The Sound of 13 and an upcoming show that we've called Gateways Radio. Aside from those things, I've given lectures, presentations, and keynotes on this topic and many others, with the goal of planting a seed in people's minds that I hope will grow into measurable action from institutions and eventually true justice and true healing. I really appreciate the invitation, and I'm glad to be here.
Well, I am very glad to have you here, without a doubt. And last but certainly not least, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Eun Lee. As a teacher, musician, and arts professional, Eun Lee has prioritized socially relevant musical experiences for audiences of all ages. From 2012 to 2016, Eun worked as a teaching artist throughout New York City, and since 2015 has worked as an administrator at institutions such as the Orchestra of St. Luke's and Carnegie Hall. She currently serves as a senior manager of new initiatives at Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts. Eun is also the executive director of the Dream Unfinished, an activist orchestra, which she co-founded in 2014. She has been invited to speak on the Dream Unfinished at Chamber Music America, the Kennedy Center, Harvard University, and other institutions. Eun is a graduate of Northwestern University's School of Music. Please join me in welcoming Eun Lee.
No, thank you, Darrell. And it's such a pleasure to be a part of this conversation. And I mean, Garrett was already sort of getting us started underway, so I don't want to say too much more of a preamble about myself. I did want to provide a bit of context around the Dream Unfinished, because it's likely that there are folks out there who have no idea who we are. I'm pretty sure everyone's heard of Lincoln Center, for what it's worth. But, so that's where I hang my day job hat. And as far as the Dream Unfinished, so as Darrell had mentioned, yes, we consider ourselves an activist orchestra. And what that means is using this sort of unusual tool of classical music as a way to talk about issues that are very central as far as social and racial inequities that are currently surrounding us. So we do that through music programming. We do that through engagement with noted figures and speakers, and partnership with community-based organizations. And we have, it's interesting because we were founded largely sort of in critique of a lot of these sorts of topics that I think we're about to be talking about some more. So, you know, where we were founded in 2014, 2015, and looking at the landscape now in 2021, it's been an interesting journey. And I think we're going to talk about some of that here.
And let me just say, I've collaborated with Eun in a number of different capacities, one of which being bringing in the Dream Unfinished when I was still at Lincoln Center. And just the work that they're doing is absolutely incredible. And it's all, you know, under Un's leadership. So if you don't know the Dream Unfinished, please look them up. Maybe we can drop them in the chat or something. So let's get into this conversation today. And as U mentioned, Garrett is already getting into it. I was like, oh, let's go. So let's start with this idea of justice, right? What does justice mean to each of you individually, and how can it be used as a tool for liberation, particularly within this music space, thinking about the music industry or the classical music space?
I'll get us started by saying it's hard for me to define justice specifically in art spaces because I think we're barely seeing resistance. I see resistance as a mean towards justice. And once more of us refuse to participate in these inequitable spaces, specifically refuse to participate in all white spaces in the diverse so-called United States of America, we will begin to understand what justice could look like. But the question brings me much sorrow, defining justice in art spaces, because I think step number one is seeing resistance, which we're seeing so little of in the arts ecosystem, certainly from the big institutions in the arts ecosystem.
That's awesome. And I would jump in there. Obviously, the ideal of justice is, the equal and fair treatment, the end of the biases, and a compassionate space, all rooted in love and all rooted in our natural, authentic talents. But in the industry, where as it relates to music, there is this space where our artists have opportunities to challenge and to narrate the forms of oppression and the forms of things that we're experiencing. So it's not all for entertainment. This is the opportunity where they can tell a story through music, through content. And so I would challenge people to take advantage of the influence that you have, and really to educate in spaces in which we are not being educated. The arts and culture programs don't even exist in our educational system. If you go to public schools, you probably won't even see an arts and culture program. So we have to not only look at what we're doing now, but we have to look at how do we reinvent something that belongs to us, that's being exploited, and we're not being educated in those spaces correctly.
I'll try to weigh in here, and forgive me for being maybe that guy, but I'm going to drop the question into the chat just so that the attendees can actually read the text out loud. Maybe it's the old classroom teacher in me that will never die. But, I've been reviewing since having gotten introduced to this group when we were preparing for today's conversation. And I've been just really sort of sitting back and looking at the question itself. And I do think that a lot of the cultural climate right now really demands that we take that step back and think about what words mean. And so when we saw this question around justice as a tool in the industry, I actually took a beat to open up a dictionary and to look at the definition of justice and the definition of industry. And justice is exactly as what Pat was just saying. It's this idea of a just treatment and equity in terms of opportunities. But then industry is some sort of generally transactional agreement as far as then what kind of service is being rendered. And I think on paper, in an ideal world, the arts should be an industry in which there is a justice that's reached, right? Because it's not like you're necessarily taking some raw material from someone else in order to then repackage it and sell it. What should be that sort of ideal triangle is there is an artist who has their work that they want to be sharing. There's a ready and willing audience and that wants to be a consumer of that work. And then there's an institution that is generally the way that's sort of housing all of this so that it can be facilitated. But yeah, I don't think justice is a tool. I think justice is the end goal. As far as, are these three parties actually having what they are asking for in a way that is not exploitative across any of the three? And, I think even separate, obviously race is absolutely central to untangling some of this. But like, I mean, frankly, I think even separate of that, there are these questions of musicians, especially by and large freelancers, that are very much feeling like they've been manipulated or they're being exploited, excuse me. So I think it's less this question of, is justice the tool, and more, what are the tools that we need to get to a just treatment, so that this triangle exists in a way where, all parties are agreeing to the terms as far as, how they are in relationship with one another.
Wow, thank you for that. I'm thinking about Cornel West, who says, justice is what love looks like in public. And I think thinking about it from that framework, which I do personally agree with, I'm not sure if justice to me is the destination. And this, again, is kind of where there can be divergent thought. I think liberation is the destination. And all these things are bridges to get us towards there, especially when you start thinking about justice in more of a punitive type sense. Like, think about it in something like in terms of reparations, right? So we have a conversation around reparations, something that, those that were enslaved are still trying to get what was so-and-so transacted or promised towards them. But you have people who were owners of the enslaved who definitely got their reparations as soon as it ended. So to me, really, it is this idea of what does love, like this contract of that with America looks like in a public sphere, which I think we are missing. I don't know. That's just me though. But along with that, like, what are some other ways that we think colonialism may show up within like the music industry that people may not be considering and day to day?
I have a specific answer to that question, but before I go there, I just wanted to say that Pat, both you and Un, you've gotten me thinking about the school system. And Un, when you use that word exploit, I think about how many of these pipelines that are viewed as benevolent are actually so very harmful. So we talk a lot about arts in the public school system and how they're disappearing. I learned to play the bassoon in my public school. I know how to play the bassoon today because the school in my neighborhood had a bassoon and they had a teacher that was able to do that for me. Now, as much as that is incredible when you're a 7th or an 8th grader, what does that mean 10 years down the line when you've stuck with something and you're one of these freelancers that Un is speaking to that can't find work? Certainly a Black freelancer who can't find work in a space that is equitable towards them. So I had to name that because that came straight into my mind based on what the both of you said. When it comes to colonialism showing up in a way that people may not consider day to day, I think one thing that we have to think about, is something that I think about a lot in my work, is algorithms, how algorithms are a leg of that. So my show, Triloquy, is one of the more popular ones when it comes to challenging the notion of classical music in that space. So when your DSP, whatever you use to listen to, is suggesting other shows to my audience, they're pointing folks toward other incredible podcasts like Classically Black, Black Arts Admin Bitch, hosted by Quanice Floyd, and so many other ones. Okay, so once those internet algorithms point listeners to the peripheral non-Black shows, the circle never actually comes back around. Triloquy is not a show that you're likely to see unless you're specifically looking for something at the intersection of race and music. I believe this can be seen anywhere. The way digital streaming services suggest viewing and listening based on that white-centric lens is one of the biggest challenges I face, and one of the many things that I feel like we just don't see or we don't talk about every day. I know that's a very specific issue, but I just wanted to name that just to introduce that idea into people's minds, the way colonialism has even entered AI spaces.
I think that was a great response, and thank you for sharing that. When I think about that question, I often think about the immediacy of when artists are performing and all of the immediate fame and all of that rah-rah that goes around them. But then there's this complete disconnect in reference to ownership and equity and what they own. So when you hear things like licensing and masters and the business education and navigation behind being the creators of your content and how to maximize your long-term profitability on the content that you've created, the music that you've created, that's a big area in which is being exploited. And I don't think that there's a huge area in which people are being educated in that space, because maybe the reward is upfront, performing, getting a contract, but not really looking behind the scenes and understanding that there is going to be a long-term effect where others are profiting off of what you initially put out into the world. So I think that's a huge space.
I really appreciate both Garrett and Pat's very clear extrapolations of how this shows up. I think the examples that I would want to share are probably a little bit more like apples to apples. So as an example, I'm not sure if folks are aware on this call, but Lincoln Center was actually founded by essentially invading and taking land. For folks who aren't aware, so it had been this community that was categorized as a slum, San Juan Hill, and it was basically through the power brokering of Robert Moses that land was then able to be collected and organized, and so there was an entire community of people who were displaced so that a performing arts center could be positioned there. And then even separately of that, just dropping in another link. So this is a ladder that I reference quite a bit whenever we're kind of called in to do these sorts of trainings and presentations. And it's this idea of from Sherry Arnstein around like the ladder of citizen participation. And this is, I'll try to be brief because there are so many other meaty questions to get to. But the context of this is, and this, she had actually devised this not for what we're talking about, but more, immediate community changes, like deciding if there's going to be a playground that's going to show up in a neighborhood, or deciding if there's going to be like a community rec center. And the reason why she used this framework was, well, then how much is the community where this playground or this rec center is being developed and built, how much input and influence and power do they actually have in making those kinds of decisions? And the reason why I share this ladder is because I think, we're seeing this evolution away from it, but a lot of arts institutions, when they are trying to have their community outreach, which is now no longer a term that people are really using, now we're calling it community engagement or social impact. I think unbeknownst to them and with the very best of intentions, they often are in this sort of, as you can see in the ladder, like the kind of the lower rungs, like the therapy, the informing, the, Beethoven's going to save the kids kind of. And like that is a form of colonialism, because that is a way in which, you are inviting yourself into someone else's home and then, starting to, make changes on their behalf. Even if you do have good intentions behind it, you're still a guest, or you should realize you're a guest. But maybe I think in some instances people aren't acknowledging and behaving and comporting as such. So I think that it's that sort of sometimes subconscious ways in which colonialism can show up, as far as how arts organizations are in relationship with the communities that they are serving. That was something that I'd wanted to point out.
That's incredible. I love that ladder. And it's making me think too, even like zooming out a step farther, like thinking about how, you talked about how Lincoln Center kind of came to be. I'm thinking about how the entire nonprofit industrial complex has actually come to be, and especially what it is that we know of it today. And, just to face it, a lot of the reasons why having these types of conversations in different spaces is important is because it really is to remember, like, it is good to remember how, these nonprofit spaces, these theaters, the dance halls were actually built on a separatist model to begin with. They were built on the backs of like Reconstruction and segregation from the beginning. Everybody had a certain place within these halls. And so honestly, this idea of us sharing these spaces in the ways in which we are doing is actually counterintuitive to the way in which they were set up to begin with, right? Because these are still like these spaces, these industries, these organizations are all stemming from the same sort of white supremacist tree that we talk about when we start looking at housing or when we start looking about health disparities. Like, it's all under the same umbrella when we start thinking about education. So with that sort of in mind, how do we as artists, as educators, as administrators, as creators, how do we begin to start to disrupt these sort of white supremacy traits that are inherent in the fields in which we occupy?
Yeah, and I promise I won't piggyback every single time, but just so much inspires me when I hear, when Un uses the phrase community engagement. I think there's a woman who I had the extreme pleasure of working with and featuring on my podcast. Her name is Donna Walker Kuhn, a native of Harlem. And what she just opened my eyes to completely was that many arts institutions go about community engagement in a way that is actually audience development. And those two things are extremely different. Audience development is fully transactional. We're doing this thing so that you will come into our space and give us money, while community engagement should not be transactional. It should be these institutions engaging communities in ways that lends them power, that lends them structure. The first book that Donna Walker Kuhn wrote, I think, is called Invitation to the Party. I definitely suggest everyone take a look at that. When it comes to how we begin to disrupt white supremacy culture in these spaces, for me, as an entrepreneur, I would challenge everyone to recognize the ways in which you participate at your job. We've already, spoken to, the history of Lincoln Center. So many of our workplaces are built to maintain white supremacy, even if we can't see it. So, my short answer is, I just challenge everyone to really take their workplace and identify whether or not the organization is moving against white supremacy or not. There's no middle ground. You're doing one of those things. And as an employee in those systems, you are a participant in it. I understand that we're all oppressed by capitalism and we all have to do what we have to do. And that's a very important conversation that each and every one of us needs to have with ourselves.
I just think that's great. And, just to piggyback on that a little bit, it's in what you just asked. It's about the disruptive dialogue, right? Most times we often recognize when we identify anti-Black practices, the way we feel, we know it, we intuitively feel it, but it's our responsibility to challenge the policy. It's our responsibility to speak up against it. And you're not going to be popular in all spaces at all times. But when you get to a point where you feel like Blackness is the value of our Blackness is being voided, it is your responsibility in that moment to call it out. And that's an uncomfortable space that we have to feel comfortable in. So that's how I would just fight and press through it.
Yeah, I don't have that much more to add to what Pat and Garrett have shared already. I think, it is really just, well, I think the one thing that I would add too is as you're speaking out to, I think, find as many ways as possible to speak out in an organized fashion. And what I mean by that is, it's because I think, as Pat was saying, you don't want to, you run that risk, right? You run that vulnerability of being the one to speak out. But, I think especially now, this is a kind of cultural climate where I would say employers of all different sizes are really paying more attention to when people are voicing or airing any concerns, but especially if it's like a faction of people, because then, it is this moment now where, I've read 3 different news articles about it. Like, everyone's quitting their jobs right now. Like, everyone's fed up. Everyone's, pandemic burnt out. Also just kind of really reevaluating what their role is. And I think having some of these internal dialogues that we've been even talking about. And so, as much as it is this sort of power dynamic that exists between an employer and an employee, this is a very unique moment right now where I think employers are really having to sort of check themselves. And so if you're able to, have this and find dialogue across the organization and find other like-minded voices, and then to be able to speak in concert with one another. I think that will take it that much further than just, your one email that you send to that one person.
Ooh, thank you so much for that. That actually leads very nicely into the next question. Before I go there, I just have to say, and this is like a nice little symmetry in things. But so last year I mentioned I did a panel. So Garrett, I'm not sure, you probably didn't even know this, but one of the panelists last year was actually Donna Walker-Kuhn, because where else would you start, especially in this space? So wow, that's just amazing. And Un, you definitely teed off the next set of questions so nicely. Thinking about this, like in speaking out in different spaces, or doing this work, like I often think of like the work of abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, like Harriet Tubman, and even more specifically thinking about Harriet. Harriet had a lot of accomplices and co-conspirators along her journey. It was not a task that she took on alone. And so in thinking about that, what would each of you recommend to someone as a first step who may be actively trying to close some of these opportunity gaps, or talk about some of these issues within the industry or at their organizations? And maybe they don't actually have the help from their peers or their executives or their administrators. Like, what do you do when you are trying to build that momentum? You mentioned doing it in an organized way, which I completely agree with. And it's how do we start to build that momentum and find maybe those accomplices?
Yeah, I'll quickly answer that question by offering an anecdote. So a couple months back, when Asian hate, violence against Asian Americans was really at the front of the conversation, I saw many news stations highlighting Black violence against Asian Americans, and that really made me feel a way. So as my means of not harboring anything inappropriate, I took the time to really do research about Asian Americans who helped Black communities specifically. And a woman whose name that I'm so grateful to have learned is, I believe now, the late Grace Lee Boggs, who lived in Detroit, in Michigan, and really embedded herself in communities. We use the words allies and accomplices. Liberation. Grace Lee Boggs had something to lose as well. She was on the ground with the people. So, as far as getting that ball rolling, I think that so many people don't actually understand what the struggle is, don't actually understand what the problem is. I would encourage everyone, especially every white person, to really embed themselves in a community where they can get that perspective. I know we're saying a lot of names, but there's an incredible documentary. I think the whole thing is on YouTube, actually, about the work of Grace Lee Boggs. When you can really learn about the levels to which she embedded herself in the community, it's very easy to see how her accompliceship manifested, because she had something to lose as well. I think we approach a lot of this work from a distance. We need to approach this work from within it.
That's awesome. And I echo what you're saying here. I think it really, in order to be a strong advocate for anything, that you have to be in a space where you're comfortable and you know what you need to know. So the education and the research is really important. When I think about the abolition theory and just think about all of the things that are involved there, I started recently doing my research on Emory Douglas, who was the Minister of Culture for the Black Panther Party, and did all of the artwork for the Black Panther Party. So there's so much history and research there, things that would never be shared in a public school setting. I had to wait all the way until I'm in my 50s to start really understanding my history, and I shamefully so, but this is the way that the system is programmed, and you don't have a lot of outlets to research. So if you want to be a steward, a good advocate of any change, I think the first step is to educate yourself, research, align yourself with strong groups that can teach you something. And those may be spaces that you don't know anything about, but it's okay to get in a space and become a sponge and to get information that will make you well-versed and more confident as you go out and start to create change.
I want to shout out Bridget, who is silently dropping all of these very useful resources and links as we're discussing. And also piggyback off of specifically Garrett McQueen's shout out for Grace Lee Boggs. Sorry, my brain's like frying because I can't multitask and drop links. So I'm saying full names for some weird reason. So, but I wanted to drop that because not very many people know who Grace Lee Boggs is, period. But then not very many, even fewer people know that she was actually integral in organizing this arts and activism conference that took place in, of all places, Flint, Michigan, before before Flint has become what it's become. And so I just wanted to drop that as a resource. And she wrote a speech that was shared during that conference, which I think is really apropos to what it is that we're discussing. But I think similarly to what both of my co-panelists were saying, as far as like that moment of self-education, I think it's also really important to, and I want to phrase this carefully, but like, if you're going to be, if this sort of work is of interest to you, then to be very clear too of how it is that you are benefiting from it. And I don't want to say that so that it's not altruistic, but and maybe this is revealing some more of my political leanings that I want, but there's a very useful article that I just dropped in the link, and it talks about this distinction between allyship versus solidarity. And I think that is really unique and helpful, because I think, like allyship, I think the article goes into much better detail about it, but it's this place that's out of like some sort of like moral or ethical obligation. And it's something that I think, whenever I am asked to do sorts of like trainings and whatnot, I may differ from others, but one of the very first things that I say to an organization is, I'm not interested in white guilt. And I think that is often a sort of source where this allyship comes out of. And like, it was like, I posted on Instagram recently, like there's now a section in the Hallmark cards when you go into a CVS, and it's like the allyship cards. And it's like, I'm seeing your face, Thorell.
Not yet.
No, it's real. It exists. I have a photo. Like, I will drop the link to show my photographic evidence. I will, absolutely. But like, so like, that's the thing. Like, you can show allyship. You can buy a card for $6 and say, here you are. Whereas solidarity, I think, is a much deeper rooted thing of like, what do I gain from a collective liberation? What is it that I will have that will then serve me and serve what I want to do in my life by entering into, this work, as we're calling it. So I think, that would be like, it would be that sort of self-interrogation that I would invite people to do as they're thinking of, starting up anything wherever they are.
Whoo, yes. My brain is going so crazy. I was thinking about Gary, you were making me think about Brian Stevenson's quote and getting proximate with the person, but also this idea of allies taking up space where, accomplices and co-conspirators are actually taking up risk. And that's a huge difference and differentiation there. Whoa. So I want to talk about, because we're talking about disruption and we're talking about like these sort of new forms of communication and expression. And I know we have at least a couple of hip hop heads on this panel. I'm curious, where does hip hop fit into this conversation around equity and justice within the music space?
First of all, thank you for sharing that ally card. I'm surprised that I haven't yet received one. So the first thing I'll say to that question is, one of the things I hate about hip hop culture is when people talk about their favorite female rapper. I hate that phrase, because these are rappers. Nicki Minaj she carried the whole genre on her back. for almost a decade. So to that, I love to speak about my favorite male rapper, since we, just to flip the script a little bit, who is Drake. I'm going to read a couple of his lyrics here from a tune from his album Scorpion called Emotionless. It says, "Good-hearted people are taking it to extremes, leaving me in limbo to question what I believe, leaving me to ask what's their motive in making peace, leaving me not to trust anybody I meet, leaving me to ask, is there anybody like me?" I stick with that song so much and I listen to it a lot because if it speaks to me in the way it does in my work, I know that it speaks to millions of other people who aren't even in this sort of work. So when we talk about hip hop, I think about the latest evolution of what is most classical to the United States. A sentence that I repeat on all of these panels is, with the exception of what was codified by indigenous people, there is nothing in the so-called United States that is more musically foundational than the Negro spiritual. It didn't come from anywhere. It wasn't imported from anywhere else. It was created from the soil here in the United States. William Grant still speaks to that when he names his second symphony Song of a New Race. So when we talk about the evolutions of that music, we get into jazz, we get into blues, gospel, all of these classic forms of music, all the way to what we have today as hip hop music, rap, and all those sorts of things. So I think for the most decolonized mind, hip hop is the prime example of how we should be recentering conversations around music and music education. If we can accept and really normalize the fact that hip hop music is American classical music, I think so many other things will fall into place. Not that, there isn't a lot of other action that has to happen, but for me, that's a conversation that's hip hop aligned that I really try to push forward in my work.
That's great. So I'm just going to talk about it from the realest angle that I can, right? Because, the Black man has so much to deal with as it is. The Black man who takes on the persona of the hip hop lifestyle and the hip hop culture is viewed in a negative space, right? And has that much more risk and things to deal with. However, on the flip side of that, we have brands that take full advantage and economically profit millions of dollars off of the art we create, and not understanding that hip hop is really a therapeutic tool for our community, for our lifestyle, right? So they don't take the time to understand the therapeutic tool that it is for many and has and continues to be for many, but use it as a marketing profitability platform. So I challenge the artists who have these massive platforms and massive opportunities to shape and mold minds to take full advantage when they have the opportunity to put out conscious messaging, to make sure that they're involved not only in their bigger scheme of things, but to be involved in local community initiatives and to really make a difference in where they can make it. Because hip hop and the culture, it spews everything. It's who we are. It's what we know. It's how we live. It's how we grow up. It's how it shapes our character. It shapes our being. It shapes all of these things that spout around in music, and it's alive. And people want to understand it for when it's good, when it benefits them. But then there's this other side of it that comes with hip hop culture that is really not accepted. And we see that play out in brutality. We see that play out in with our young Black men in the streets, particularly. So a lot of conversation there, but a lot of road work to do. I would think I would like to put a lot of the onus on some of the artists, but also to those people that are sitting behind the record labels and making decisions, conscious programming and making sure behind the scenes that we're, initiating our demands up front.
So I'll be the very first to admit that this question is above my pay grade. But what I would like to contribute is that, it's interesting, actually. I think in regards to music education specifically, there's so much that's actually really rich in terms of the practice of hip hop that I think we should be adopting much more broadly. What I ended up doing as sort of my, I guess, like senior thesis project when I was at school was this ethnography of a hip hop dance group on campus. And the reason why was because I remember I was observing their rehearsals, and the way that they would have these practice sessions was this giant mirror where there are people of all different skills and levels and abilities, people that had started yesterday versus people who are very seasoned breakers. And the way that these practice sessions ran was that someone with like zero experience could just walk over and tap someone else on the shoulder and be like, can you teach me how to do that? And I remember seeing that and seeing that openness for sharing and dialogue, and then contrasting that with the music school building where we were all like tucked away in our practice rooms and like being hyper competitive with one another. And like, what if I could have knocked on the practice room door of another musician and said, hey, can you teach me how to do that? And so like that openness of a true community and of sharing and of doing that in real time, I think is something that so many musical practices could directly be benefiting from and learning from. And just another resource that I wanted to drop, but there is a academic who we work with a bunch at Lincoln Center named Dr. Chris Emden. And he does a lot around, taking some of these cultural practices, but then reimagining them in a classroom setting, like how you can sort of orchestrate a cipher, but that it's a real meanings to have a real and open and transparent dialogue between a teacher and students. So, just in terms of like how culture comports itself, I think that there could be so much to be benefited from if we were to really look at this and take it quite seriously, and then think of ways in which it could be applied elsewhere.
Ooh, thank you so much for bringing Dr. Emden in this space. That is definitely a mentor of mine for sure. I wanted to take a moment to just point out the Q&A feature. If anyone has any questions, just to make sure I see them, please drop them in that Q&A box. I'm also, you can also put them in the chat box, although I may miss it. And I'm also looking at the live stream on YouTube as well. And I just want to lift up, there is one comment there. Bobo said, yes, AI and bias is scary. I agree. I think that was in reference to what you said earlier, Garrett. And Un, I also thought about something you said earlier about, think about like for accomplices, think about what you have to gain in this situation or what. And I knew there was a quote that reminded me of that really kind of hit me really hard. And I'm like, yes, that I do get exactly what you're saying. And it was Lila Watson. She said, if you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And absolutely. So. And I kind of want to talk a little bit more about this idea of liberation. I want to do, especially in these last few minutes, I want to do what Robin Kelly calls freedom dreaming for a second. What do you think the future generations of Black, Latinx, Asian American, and Indigenous or other young students might like hopefully living in a more liberated future? What do you think they will say about the work that we're doing today in our respective spaces, but maybe even more specifically, the panel discussion that we're having here today, June 25th, 2021?
Yeah, the first thing that I want to say is that, again, to the idea of someone's liberation being wrapped up in hours when it comes to this work. What's scary for a lot of people is that they have something to lose with that, because they have gained from the inequitable system. So, I mean, I think it's very important to name that as well. Something that I think a lot about is the way our generation looks at the previous generations and some of the frustrations that we may have there. The idea that some of the elders pass it down that, we're doing too much, or we're too radical, or you just can't go around doing X, Y, and Z. So when it comes to future generations, my hope is that in the year 2080, 2090, they will say that we were not respectable, that we didn't play by the rules because, we're trying to stay safe while doing the work. I was in that New York Times feature for my podcast. I was also described as reckless, and I take that as a huge compliment. That's the energy that I hope the future generations see from the work we're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think you said it best. But, for me, when I think about what I would want the future generations to talk about is that, we've really laid some good groundwork to have conversations, but these conversations shouldn't be highlighted as we have to talk about this. Like there should be a different environment, one that's rooted in love, where, racial identity really does not determine how well one fares in the environment. And so, women leadership, I would love to see more women leaders doing things in all spaces. All of these things, pay equity, all of these things are being addressed. So, I think these conversations should be continuous. I think that they should always have an educational component to it. And I'm looking forward to seeing the next generation of leaders.
Well, to pick up from what Pat was just saying, I think a lot of these, like Pat, a lot of what you were saying, I think they're actually the outcomes of what needs to get done, like pay equity, greater representation, more diverse representation. That will come as a result of us fixing, like the consequences of redlining that we're still tasked with. That will come with desegregating education. So my hope is that the future generations will, between now and then, all of those things would have been fixed. So then the future generations can really look back on us as almost like a dark ages. Like, how did they not have mandatory paid leave for new parents? How did they not have, like whatever it is that is so, and I think that is something that luckily I think generally does happen from generation to generation, because now we are at the stage where there are still people alive who, as an example, gay marriage was illegal in our lifetimes. But now, you have little kids growing up who are growing up in these, same-sex couples and households, and it's well, of course this is allowed. So I think, my hope is that the future generation will be looking back on what it was that we have not yet accomplished, but have all of those things, fixed, handled, then they can, lift their heads up and, like what Pat was saying, really live and exist in this world where, we're not tribalized and we're not, so bound to identity markers, and instead that it is an actual meritocracy. And hopefully that the groundwork is laid to actually get there.
Oof. Yes. The only other thing I kind of think about with that is I think of a lot about movements, even going back to, I mentioned Harriet Tubman earlier. I mean, Harriet was in her 20s when she was in her teens when she started making her trips. And I think of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Fred Hampton, Angela Davis. They were the youth who was moving things, and so a lot of times, we kind of look to them, but I think they're gonna inform us on where we need to go if we start to listen long enough. So we're now down in the last few minutes of the panel, and so I wanted to open it up an open question. Is there any parting words that any of you would like to say to those who may be listening?
Yeah, we've said the name Harriet Tubman a few times in this space. So, as a podcaster, I want to shout out Crystals from the Read podcast that's very popular, that most people know, for really shedding light on the story of Harriet Tubman on her featured episode of Drunk History. I think people don't remember that, this teenage girl was involved in military action, was planning things, is noted as the first woman in American history to lead a military plan, so the information out there is rich if you're, open to being embedded in a culture that views things differently, that presents things from a different perspective. Even if you're sitting across from Derek Waters drunk telling the story, there's something there. But as far as, final thoughts, we've also been speaking to women leaders. I want to give a shout out to Vanessa Rose over at the American Composers Forum, who planted the seed in my mind that you only believe in what you pay for. I'll say that again. You only believe in what you pay for. So if you believe in anti-racism, if you believe in equity, you need to find an activist. You need to find an activist orchestra, an institution, something to contribute to daily, weekly, monthly. Because if you aren't paying for it, if you aren't putting your most valuable resource toward it, you don't actually believe in it.
Awesome. I got to listen to his podcast, man. This is not going to be enough on this 52 minutes. So yeah, this has been a great opportunity. And I'll just say this is that things that I know to be true is that power in this country is unequally distributed. Privilege is afforded to some, equality belongs to all. And so with those three things, we will continue to press, we will continue to educate ourselves, and we will continue to live in our full Black experiences, unashamed and pushing forward to make a difference for our current existence and for those that are ahead of us and those that are coming up behind us.
Well, it's hard to follow up to either of these folks. So what I can do is some shameless self-promotion. So, we were mentioning Harriet Tubman, and there was actually an episode of the Dream Unfinished's YouTube show where we featured actually exactly what Garrett was talking about, the fact that she has this really uncelebrated military history. And even after all of this incredible courage and bravery, that she still had to fight for a pension to acknowledge her service. And so wanting to just share that as if you want to go down that Harriet Tubman rabbit hole. But I think the Harriet Tubman factoid that I would like to share is not very many people know, but she lived with a disability almost her entire adult life. So she was actually struck with I think it was like a small anvil, or it was like a 5-pound weight. It was something heavy, and it struck her on her temple. And as a result of that, she would actually go into these sorts of fits and lapses where she would fall asleep. It was this very sudden onset narcolepsy. And so not only was she saving however many, dozens of people and transporting them across state lines so that they could be, in freedom, but during these rescue missions, she would be falling asleep. I just can't. And so the reason why I'm sharing that as my sort of incredulous last note is to realize and to just put yourself in that position of the kind of bravery and the kind of persistence and the kind of tenacity that it takes if you are wanting to really kind of enter into this work, and to realize that there will be some enemies that are made. There will be some people that you may accidentally offend. There may be some mistakes that you make, and you may look back on it and realize oh, that was really not the way that I needed to go. But if it is the work that you're interested in really getting into and involving yourself in, then to know that it comes at its own cost. But I think that all the people that are on this particular conversation are in it for the long haul. So with that, finding those sorts of kindred spirits so that you can be sustaining yourself and finding that well of persistence and resilience as you move forward.
Wow. Well, with that, I would like to thank you, Un. Thank you, Patricia. Thank you, Garrett. Thank you, Jennifer Kessler. Thank you, Bridget. Thank you, Ross Carr. Thank you to International Contemporary Ensemble. Thank you to the New School. And thank you to all the attendees here today. This is one conversation on a continuum of many that need to be had, and many actions that also need to be had to take us to where it is that, hopefully we're all trying to go. And thank you for this opportunity for us to be able to share space. And please feel free to keep in touch with any of us. Jennifer, did you want to give some closing words?
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to thank Dr. Cooper one more time for joining us for a second year in a row of Ensemble Evolution, and to all of the panelists today for sharing your time and your thoughts. We have a lot of reading to do. If you haven't read or watched all of the amazing resources that were shared, we'll make sure to get those to you. And thank you all again. We'll see you soon.